This is panel number 3, the third session for the colloquium. I'd like to say that this panel is about superheroes and suburbanization, but that misses some of the points that will be brought up by our presenters today. The protocol we'll use, I will be introducing all of our presenters. They will come and give their presentation. We're asking each of you to limit to 20 minutes each, and then afterwards we will open this to the audience for a Q&A. And let me go through the presenters and a brief intro as to who they are and what they're doing. Our first presenter is Samantha Baskin. She is going to present on Superman versus Everyman, Jews, comics in Cleveland. Hence, we had the original issue of the first Superman. Okay. That would endow part of our operations. Thank you. Samantha Baskin is Professor of Art History, Cleveland State University, and Series Editor, Jews and the Cultural Imagination at the Pennsylvania State University Press. She's author of Raphael Sawyer and the Search for Modern Jewish Art, the Jewish graphic novel. Critical Approaches, Jewish Art, A Modern History with Larry Silver, among other works. She will be followed by Todd Mishney. Todd's title of this presentation is Trepidation and Turbulence Amid Turnover, Demographic Change and Jewish Interracial Neighborhood Activism in Cleveland, 1938 to 1967. Todd is an assistant professor at the University of Toledo. He specializes in U.S. history, focusing on urban history, African American history, race, ethnicity, and labor. He's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Changing Neighborhoods, Black Upward Mobility in 20th Century Cleveland. An expansion of his dissertation, it's going to be an expansion of his dissertation into a citywide study of Cleveland's black middling classes. Mark Souther, his presentation is on Jewish suburbanization and Jewish presence in, quote unquote, the city without Jews. This comes from a work by Sidney Vincent. That last title. Mark is Associate Professor of History at the Department of History, Cleveland State University. He specializes in 20th century U.S. urban and public history. His current research explores the decline and revitalization of Cleveland since World War II. He's the author of award-winning New Orleans on Parade, Tourism and the Transformation of the Crescent City. He's also the co-editor of American Tourism, Constructing a National Tradition, and numerous other articles and essays are to his credit. He's the director of the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at Cleveland State University. So we have a very interesting third session for you. Samantha, the forum is yours.
All right, my paper, it's Everyman versus Superman, but Superman plays a smaller part in this. I'm more interested in Harvey Pekar. Superman's been discussed over and over again, and I think that Harvey Pekar was way more influential in Cleveland, and his Jewishness is more influential than Superman's, so I want to go in that direction. Superman, a heroic outsider, fights for truth, justice, and the American way, garnering legions of fans and spawning countless imitators. Harvey Pekar, the ultimate everyman who embodied the role of the beleaguered outsider, fights to achieve a small portion of the American way. Pekar offered a unique, solitary voice conveying the struggles of working-class life, while Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman, the character who initiated the superhero craze in the United States, was a lone caped crusader. Both protagonists, Superman and Pekar himself, tackle injustice and other societal ills. Superman with his physical strength, and Pekar with his mighty insights. Neither Siegel and Shuster nor Pekar profited financially from their creations, but they achieved name recognition for their comics and far-reaching acclaim, along with even wider exposure from subsequent movies about their characters. And a longer discussion is how Harvey Pekar is both himself and a character. Moreover, both Siegel and Shuster and Pekar have had monuments erected in their hometown of Cleveland as a celebration of their accomplishments. Native sons Siegel and Shuster are honored at Siegel's one-time home on Kimberly Avenue in the Glenville neighborhood, with a large sign denoting S and its iconic shield for Superman. Just a few blocks away, a fence surrounds the lot where Shuster's childhood home once stood, adorned by reproductions of the cover of the first appearance of Superman in the first 13 pages of that same comic. A small permanent exhibit showcasing the world's greatest superhero is located at the baggage claim area of Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, announcing to visitors, "Welcome to Cleveland, where the legend began." A sculpture of P-Car can be found on the second floor of the Cleveland Heights Public Library branch at Lee Road, where he wrote many of his stories. So it's a desk with a relief, bronze relief sitting on top of it, and I have a detail of that on the right. There's a comic book page behind him. He's really, his gestures were notable. So this kind of quizzical gesture and cocking of the head is very Harvey P-Car. The Cleveland Public Library, as the first of their Cleveland Landmark series, issued a limited edition library card with P-Car's likeness, available to patrons for 2 years, from 2012 to 14. With manuscript in hand, P-Car walks towards the library's main branch on a typical Cleveland snowy day. It is well known that in 1938, the brainchild of two Jews from Cleveland, meaning created the world's first superhero, originally appeared in DC Comics' June 1938 issue, Action Comics. So there's no Superman comic yet. It's Action Comics. He's making a cameo. He turns out to be a phenomena. He gets his own comic. So, and this inspires the new genre of superhero comics that only grows bigger by the day. Almost 40 years later, in 1976, another Jew from Cleveland helped initiate the comic in its postmodern self-referential incarnation, with the first issue of American Splendor being published. It is striking that all three creators are Jewish, the children of immigrants, and stem from the city of Cleveland, Ohio. While Siegel and Schuster's backgrounds have received more than their fair share of attention, as I said earlier, and the story of Superman's creation has been talked about, P-Car's background in unabashedly Cleveland-centered stories could use some additional fleshing out. To that end, my chapter is going to ask, how does P-Car's quotidian comic persona connect with Cleveland, the city he loved? What role does his Jewishness play in his work? And is that a particularly Cleveland Jewishness, and what does that even mean? And finally, what does the posthumous celebration of P-Car's life say about Cleveland? In 1976, P-Car self-published the first issue of American Splendor. These are not the first issues. I showed that at first. I want you to see some other issues. There were 39 total until 2008. And then he didn't stop American Splendor. He started publishing full-length graphic novels or graphic narratives. In American Splendor, he wrote autobiographical accounts that were illustrated by a variety of esteemed comic artists, including R. Crumb. R. Crumb was an underground comics indie luminary, and early on he encouraged P-Car to create comics when the aspiring writer presented Crumb with a series of crude stick figures, and that's the most that P-Car could ever draw. Well, Superman was introduced by the vivid account, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. American Splendor is prefaced by the less spectacular words, "From off the streets of Cleveland comes." And you can see that it's at the top of all the comics before it says American Splendor. Each issue, bound between brightly illustrated comic paper covers in true comic book form, chronicled the mundane aspects of the curmudgeonly P-Car's life, and the interior is always in black and white. We hear about his money difficulties, car problems, health issues, including his chronic depression, among many other woes. A recurring subject of American Splendor was P-Car's experiences as a file clerk for the Veteran Administration Hospital, where he worked for 36 years with an oddball cast of characters, and that's a whole other story. While Superman offers pure escapism, P-Car offers a world from which one might want to escape. Within a decade after the unassuming comic book appeared, P-Car achieved a fair amount of fame. The 80s saw 3 theatrical adaptations of American Splendor in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C., and then the Hollywood Theater in Los Angeles. And that was in 85, 87, and 1990, respectively. An anthologized release of several issues came out in 1986, followed by several more. They garnered a larger fan base and an American Book Award. As his profile grew, P-Car appeared 7 times on Late Night with David Letterman. Most memorably in 1988, when the cantankerous guest berated his host over his compliance with General Electric, for which P-Car felt Letterman acted as a shill. By 1993, American Splendor had achieved a large enough following to be picked up by a major comics publisher, Dark Horse Comics, which it distributed until 2002. From 2002 to 2008, Vertigo distributed American Splendor. Vertigo's a subsidiary of DC Comics, which published Superman. For the still uninitiated, Picard reached larger consciousness with the release of the eponymous film adaptation. It's in part a creative documentary about Picard's life, starring Paul Giamatti as Picard. And here, Picard's on the left and Paul Giamatti's on the right. Cleveland's own self-effacing file clerk appeared on the red carpet at the Sundance Film Festival, where the movie won the Grand Jury Prize for Dramatic Film. The film also won a Best Adapted Screenplay award from the Writers Guild of America. True to character, a disheveled, irritable Picard attended these events and also the Academy Awards with his wife Joyce Brabner when the film was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. Interviewed on the red carpet at the Academy Awards, Picard said, "It's all bullshit." Picard's comics, eschewing fantasy and the pervasive superhero genre, which Picard saw as formulaic, pioneered the graphic memoir, taken to its heights by another Jew, Art Spiegelman, with his Pulitzer Prize-winning Holocaust graphic narrative, Mouse. And Harvey Picard was very critical of Mouse in American Splendor, among other places. With references to Picard's Jewishness pepper American Splendor, which always prominently featured Cleveland, it was in the last years of Picard's life that he allowed his Jewish identity to take precedence. Indeed, that fertile period saw the publication of 4 independent graphic narratives on Jewish themes: The Quitter from 2005, Yiddishkeit from 2011, Harvey Picard's Cleveland from 2012, and Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me from 2012 as well. The last 3 were posthumously published. He died in 2010 unexpectedly. And so these books were finished by the artist. The narrative had already been written, and in the case of Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me, his widow Joyce Brabner helped out. And it ends with her when she was. The end of it is when she's talking about his funeral and how what she chose for his funeral, and it was a Jewish funeral. The majority of my chapter will focus on these 4 book-length graphic narratives, but I will still address instances of Jewishness in American Splendor. Today I want to briefly mention 2 of Picard's well-known American Splendor anecdotes about Jews. One of his most reproduced stories, illustrated by R. Crumb, is titled Standing Behind Old Jewish Ladies in Supermarkets. It's from 1978. I'm sorry you can't see it so well because the lights are up, but it's really terrific. It wittily, if not stereotypically, captures Picard's frustration of standing behind elderly Jewish women, questioning prices and proffering coupons, to the dismay of hurrying customers waiting in line to check out. Picard censures such haggling, calling the old Jewish women really penny-wise. And there's some problems with this. He explains he's a Yid too, and he's playing on stereotypes of the miserly Jew. This story was refashioned in a hybrid live and comic form in the film version of American Splendor. So we have Paul Giamatti with his comic. This is in the middle of the movie. It's a great film. I recommend it. It may be the shortest line, but I'm taking a risk because she's an old Jewish lady. He gets frustrated in the film still underneath, and we see his frustration. Another example came in 1987 when Picard learns about Cleveland's old Jewish rag peddlers in a 2-page story. And he gets taken back in time in this story. Of interest, the first issue of American Splendor, published by Dark Horse Comics in 1993, was his most openly Jewish to date at the time. And here is the cover of that. His mother is there, and she's using his Yiddish name. There's Heschel. It was as if being picked up by a reputable publisher gave Picard the imprimatur he needed to open up about his heritage. Almost 30 years later in The Quitter, Picard offers a linear narrative in his most personal confessional. The Quitter addresses his Jewish origins in depth while aiming more broadly to chronicle the slice-of-life experiences that led to the creation of American Splendor, along with the writer's attendant negativity and all-pervasive kvetching. Illustrated by Dean Haspel in shadowy gradations of black and white, The Quitter opens with Picar's matter-of-fact statement. It's in the blurb right there, as he breaks the third wall from the start. This is a technique that recurs throughout the story. He says, "I was born in Cleveland, Ohio on October 8, 1939, 5 weeks after World War II started. For what's that worth? For what's that worth to anyone?" He's always self-deprecating. Setting the story in Cleveland at the outset is not just Picar's way of announcing his birthplace. Considering the prominence of Cleveland in his work and Picar's palpable fondness for his native home, he acts once again as a champion of the struggling community in which he was raised. To be sure, Picar's desire to rectify the perception of Cleveland's reputation as the mistake by the lake is the purpose of his 2012 homage to Cleveland, which I'll talk about in a moment. The first 16 pages of The Quitter cover his childhood through his bar mitzvah, which took place in an Orthodox synagogue. His parents' immigrant story dominates the second page of the book. So the second page is on the left. We can see this, this map, Poland, Ohio, and they're walking towards their future. There's a lot of really interesting information that's conveyed in the blurbs here. A horizontal panel extends the length of the page. Again, we see the journey there, followed by their establishment of a grocery store in the small working class community of Mount Pleasant, an ethnically mixed neighborhood comprised of Jews and Italians. Anchored by Kinsman Avenue, the neighborhood boasted vital Jewish institutions, including Orthodox synagogues, the Kinsman Jewish Center, and the headquarters of the Workmen's Circle. The Picar family lived in Mount Pleasant until the 1950s, when the population became predominantly black, and many Jewish families moved to the suburbs. The elder Picar, Saul, who studied Talmud in his free time and enjoyed listening to cantorial music, and his wife Dora, conversely a staunch communist committed to social justice, sent their son to Hebrew school from the age of 6, which he attended 4 days a week until his bar mitzvah. So we get a sense of his dad being a Talmudic scholar in the bottom panel. Here on the left, we have, I didn't put up, that was too much. I did not put up the Sunday school. But a pivotal moment occurs in the panel on the left. The family, eager to go to a Jewish neighborhood, moved to Shaker Heights, and Harvey's thinking about that at the top, in the middle, as a young boy. A horizontal panel, the one in the middle, portrays moving day with Saul Picar picking up Harvey in an old truck, and a speech bubble that sits at nearly the center of the panel, thus accentuating its presence. The elder Picar calls for Herschel. The name is asterisked with an addendum that prominently identifies the name as Picar's Yiddish name. So there's a little asterisk. Can you see any of this? If I can what? Okay. Crucially, Picar also highlights his dad's accent, goink, or we're going goink to wherever. Crucially, Picar was not alone in his efforts to distance himself from the culture of his immigrant parents, even as he still retained a bond to his Judaism, especially as he aged. As demonstrated by The Quitter and his 3 subsequent full-length graphic novels, Picar returns to Judaism in the last years of his life, typifying the Yiddish term pintel yid, or Jewish spark. However far one strays, one remains a Jew at heart. By 16 years old, Picar had established himself as a street fighter. We see this on the right. He found it to be a way for him to earn respectability in the community. A particularly sly panel depicts high schooler and jazz fan Picar's musing about what direction his life will take. In the upper right corner, so the top right panel, we see a clean-cut Picar's enthusiastic reaction to receiving a letter from Ira Gittler, a well-known jazz critic of Jewish origin, who served as a mentor to the aspiring writer. Gittler returns in various other comics. Underneath this panel, Picar recalls receiving a job as an usher at the Heights Art Theater. The film advertised in the marquee, so it's on the right in the middle, is Somebody Up There Likes Me, starring Paul Newman as boxer Rocky Graziano. Here, Picar cleverly references one of Cleveland's most famous progeny, Paul Newman, who was raised in Shaker Heights. The theme of the film, the true-to-life story of middleweight boxer Rocky Graziano, refers to Picar's predilection for street fighting. A portion of The Quitter is about that, with the title of the movie blatantly alluding to the writer's own insecurities and desire to be accepted. Somebody up there likes me. Indeed, the larger theme of The Quitter comprises Picar's struggles with committing to any activity for which he encounters a roadblock, including dropping out of Western Reserve University after receiving a C+ on an exam, hence the book's apt title, The Quitter. Now 19 years old, Picard receives notice that an article he wrote for a jazz magazine has been accepted for publication. Picard, who had been working among other jobs as a playground attendant at a local elementary school, is thrilled. In a fully horizontal panel, cutting right through the middle, Dean Haspel's favorite technique for highlighting important events in Picard's life, he pictures the elated teenager in close-up, his eyes peering over the letter of acceptance. Two panels later, seen walking from behind, so bottom right, he's walking past a West Side deli. For Picard, all of Cleveland was game. He wasn't just stuck on the East Side. Here we have the ever-deprecating Picard musing on his success, despite, he says, despite his Jewishness and Clevelandness. He says, "It was funny, because I wasn't your Phi Beta Kappa type or ethereal poet. I was a schlub from Kinsman." The Quitter offers insights into Picard's psychic formation and attendant anxieties, the predominant subject of his childhood, as chronicled in American Splendor. At the same time, it more broadly conveys a common first-generation immigrant experience, which I address as well in my larger chapter. Harvey Picard's Cleveland, his homage to Cleveland, intertwines Cleveland history with typical American Splendor slices of life fodder. We get many key moments in Cleveland history. On the left, we have a few. There's economic depression. There's a fire on the lake. On the right, the Cleveland Indians screw up again. Readers learn the history of Picard's beloved Rust Belt city and even more about the author's life. Here's an example. Again, he talks about moving. This you can see better because it's bigger. Doesn't matter that the lights are up. They moved to Shaker because of the larger Jewish population. He spoke Yiddish as a child. You can see it's a very different style than The Quitter because it's a very different artist. And Picard takes on many incarnations because he's drawn by different people, intermittently in different comics or graphic narratives. As a side note, in Harvey Picard's Cleveland, we learn that when his second wife, an aspiring academic, wants to pursue a prestigious job out of state, and there were some other issues at play, Picard tells her that he will, quote, "not give up the decent life I've set up in Cleveland," end quote, and a divorce ensues. Let me quickly mention Picard's appearances on The David Letterman Show. On July 31st, 1987, Picard wore an On Strike Against NBC t-shirt onto the show. Letterman asked Picard how things are on the streets of Cleveland. Picard responded, "That's a stupid question. You're trying to bait me." In other words, Picard anticipated a barb to his declining city. And this was the years when Letterman was particularly mean. Not that he's a kind guy now, but by the way, on the websites for Letterman's retiring, and they say his most difficult interviews, Picard's interviews are there. Letterman brings up the Cleveland Indians, and Picard replied as would any Clevelander, "It looks like a bad year. It's disappointing we don't have any pitching." To which Dave comments, as if he himself were a Clevelander, "Always next year, wait till next year." Picard shakes his head. Later, Picard addressed the audience, suggesting that GE should be watched closely, noting they're being sued in Ohio because they sold nuclear reactors, and they have a long history of antitrust violations, among other accusations. Letterman calls a commercial to cut Picard off, and when the show returns, he asks Picard to cease and desist. Picard takes his diatribe further in his August 31st, 1988 appearance. At the onset, Picard brings up GE, calling Letterman a cop-out for defending the company, and then offers his inflammatory comment that Letterman looks like a shill. Letterman gets visibly angry and uncomfortable, it's so great, and ultimately tells Picard that he will not be invited back to the show. In a bullying manner, Letterman holds up an issue of American Splendor, calls it a Mickey Mouse magazine, and Harvey a dork. The icing on the cake occurs at the end of the interchange when Letterman says, "I'd like to apologize to Cleveland now. You have my deepest and most heartfelt apologies." Time constraints do not allow for further analysis, but let me wrap up by summarizing the direction I'll be heading. I look further at Picar's graphic narrative, Yiddishkeit, an edited volume that nostalgically examines the far-reaching influence of Yiddish from medieval Europe to the current day. I am also investigating Harvey Picar's Cleveland in more depth, as well as Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me, about his disillusionment with the state of Israel. Not the Israel My Parents Promised Me plays out as a conversation between Picar and the artist he commissioned for the book, J.T. Waldman, in the Cleveland Heights Lee Road Library and at other Cleveland locales. As I will show in my finished chapter, Harvey Picar's comics told his story from off the streets of Cleveland, because for him, all roads led and stayed in Cleveland. Thank you. Let's get you out. Okay.
Great, thank you. I think so. Is it this here? That one? Thank you.
Don't trip.
Good morning, and thank you to everyone for coming to this seminar. Special thanks to Sean Martin, John Grabowski, Jewish Community Federation, and the other sponsors for allowing me to present my research. From the early 20th through the mid-20th century, Jewish and African American experiences interlinked in Cleveland and elsewhere, with housing and neighborhood space being the primary nexus. And by the way, people may not necessarily know this, but Cleveland in 1920 actually had proportionally the second largest Jewish population after New York City of any American city at approximately 12%. Of course, that was only about half of New York's proportion at 25%, but still, it's substantial. And it did play into the kinds of demographic transitions that I talk about in my research. It's been frequently noted that Jewish neighborhoods transitioned into African American ones in Cleveland, Glenville, and Mount Pleasant, or Kinsman as it was affectionately known to its former Jewish population, in New York, Harlem, Brownsville, Brooklyn, in Chicago, North Lawndale, and as I learned today, the Hill in Pittsburgh. And there are several factors that explain this, just to give you some overall context. One would be higher average rates of Jewish upward mobility, which created housing opportunities for upwardly mobile African Americans, with the middle class typically being the first wave to move into these neighborhoods. Jews were also not known for resisting this influx violently, unlike some Roman Catholic groups, especially Irish Americans, Polish Americans, and Italian Americans. They did not resort to violent intimidation, vandalism, or worse in attempting to halt African American influx into the neighborhoods. Some other factors are that Jewish institutions, especially smaller Orthodox synagogues, were comparatively more portable than Roman Catholic parishes, which typically included not just churches, but also parochial schools. Another factor would be patterns of work and business relations. Jewish-owned businesses were common in African American neighborhoods where they had black clientele, and Jews also employed African Americans at greater rates than any other white ethnic group. Liberal and left-wing Jews historically were active in promoting causes sensitive to African American civil rights, from the Communist Party-led activism of the 1930s and 40s through the 1960s freedom struggle. And there were also some overlapping black Jewish causes, such as the fight against employment discrimination through fair employment practices committees around the World War II era, as well as the fight against restrictive covenants, which commonly included Jews in areas like Shaker Heights, as well as African Americans. And finally, there is some, obviously, truth behind the perception that Jews could relate and identify with African Americans as a fellow oppressed minority. Although I'm careful not to overplay this, that sentiment tended to be typically strongest among Jews who are already inclined towards supporting black civil rights. And my research does reveal that Jews harbored fears and prejudices towards African Americans that were not so dissimilar from those held by other white ethnic groups living in these neighborhoods. Blacks often viewed Jews as more accepting than other whites, but sometimes also resorted to anti-Semitic stereotypes stemming from their experiences with Jewish business owners, employers, and landlords. Okay, so I just want to give you a bit of an overview. Again, as John Grabowski explained, my research is on African Americans in Cleveland, but because of this pattern of neighborhood transition, I also deal with African American and Jewish interactions extensively. And so much of my focus has been on two traditionally Jewish neighborhoods, Mount Pleasant and Glenville, which became African-American middle-class neighborhoods in the 1950s. Even before this, in the 1920s, African-Americans moved into Jewish neighborhoods lining East 55th Street. But by the period that I'm focusing on here, Glenville contains some 40% of the city's Jewish population as of 1925, and Mount Pleasant some 30%. And I am showing you here maps constructed by Howard Whipple Green, which were really state-of-the-art at the time, hence the kind of dated terminology applying to the African-American population. You can see here, if we flip between 1940 and 1950, the substantial influx into these areas. And Howard Whipple Green also did a survey of the city's Jewish population. So what I've done here is I've overlaid those two maps and color-coded them so that you can see this process more clearly. Especially in Glenville, you can see a heavily Jewish neighborhood transitioning over to a heavily African-American one as I flip through 1930, 1940, and 1950. Just to tell you a little bit about these neighborhoods, Glenville was built up from the turn of the century through the 19-teens. Mount Pleasant, mostly during the 1920s, with two-family homes, or mortgage lifters as they were nicknamed. Jewish observers noted the higher levels of homeownership in places like Glenville and Mount Pleasant, with one observer saying homes in Woodland, or the older East 55th Street neighborhood, were for the most part rented. In the new neighborhood, Jews became homeowners on a grand scale. Another Jewish observer remembered Mount Pleasant as, quote, developing quickly in the hungry search for status. My mother was coming up in the world, and so was our mortgage. And community institutions followed this outflux. Synagogues, as well as the Council Educational Alliance, the predecessor to the Jewish community centers. Glenville developed a reputation as a neighborhood of business owners and professionals, and Mount Pleasant as one of skilled tradesmen like painters and carpenters. But I believe this distinction to have been somewhat overblown, but as I'm sure all of you know, it plays very heavily into Jewish identities in Cleveland. And it was not just Jews who associated upward mobility with moving to outlying areas of the city, especially Mount Pleasant. As noted, there were other ethnic groups present, especially Italian Americans, Czechs, Hungarians, and also African Americans were present from early on. In fact, African Americans had settled in a cluster just north of Kinsman along East 126th and East 128th and 30th Streets here, starting in the 19-teens. And so this meant that they were lying far outside of the Cedar Central district that contained some 90% of Cleveland's African American population as of 1930. There are about 350 families living here in 1930, and there was already starting to develop another cluster around East 140th Street, south of Kinsman, bordering the Corlett neighborhood that was nicknamed Kinsman Heights by the Call and Post, Cleveland's African American main newspaper. This community contained a larger number of middling types of African American residents, including postal, railroad workers, truck drivers and chauffeurs, and building tradesmen. Small numbers of African Americans also arrived early on in Glenville. There was also a cluster developing around East 123rd and Beulah Avenue. But as early as 1915, there were African American families purchasing on either side of East 105th Street here in the western portion of the neighborhood. Those tended to be professional families, some of Cleveland's most elite business owners, professionals, but also the first deed actually located for an African American purchasing a home in this area was a chauffeur. Again, that was a kind of middling profession at the time. There were some 300 African American families in Glenville as of 1930, and by 1940, they stood just shy of 1,200 in their total population, which was only about 2% of the entire area. Government employees with the Homeowners Loan Corporation described the dynamic here as related to the slack housing market of the Great Depression, stating, quote, some descendants of original Orthodox Jewish occupants in this area have not been unwilling to sell to colored. So you can note some kind of disapproval there. And I extensively interviewed Jewish, Italian-American, and African-American residents in Mount Pleasant. And what I uncovered strikingly was that, well, first of all, the kind of insularity of the Mount Pleasant African-American enclave limited some of the interactions that white residents had. But for those that lived actually on the borders of that enclave, the interactions were sometimes cordial, although formal. And they didn't differ that much from the relations that Jews had with Italian Americans in that neighborhood. I uncovered evidence of children playing together, sometimes visiting each other's houses, adults trading food and conversation over the fence, black customers shopping at Italian and Jewish-owned stores, and at least one black youth being hired as a Shabbos goy or Gentile helper at a local synagogue. Some Jews employed African-American women for domestic help, although only about 10% of Mount Pleasant wives had to do that help because the community was rather economically secure. I'm showing you here a picture of Columbia Elementary School in Glenville. You can see one young black girl in that class, so that there were African Americans present in these neighborhood schools from early on. In Glenville, I've uncovered some similar evidence, although I didn't interview residents in that area. I've uncovered some sources. For example, interviews done by the Cleveland Press in the 1950s and 60s. One black man recalled a Jewish family had, quote, next door, watched silently as we moved in and went about improving the premises, but subsequently pleased at the improvement, extended neighborly relations. And in one remarkable example I uncovered in an obituary, the story of a black Tennessee migrant who got a job at a kosher poultry market in 1940, took over the business in 1965, and continued to run it until his retirement in 1988, learning to speak Yiddish in the process. So I don't mean to downplay the kinds of tensions that we all know typically characterize these kind of demographic transitions, but I just want to complicate our notions that some of these interactions were not necessarily antagonistic. There was a record of local whites violently opposing black access to local swimming facilities, the Woodland Hills pool in Mount Pleasant, as well as the beaches at Gordon Park. You can see by 1947 there's some black bathers sprinkled in there, but there were incidents at Woodland Hills starting in 1927 and going all the way into the 1940s. Notably, Jewish activists with the Communist Party were very active in promoting black civil rights and fair access to the pool. In 1936, there was a sustained push to ensure fair black access in which Communist Party-affiliated organizations, along with the NAACP, lobbied the mayor for fair access and held a prominent kind of integrated swim-in at Woodland Hills. Communist attorneys Sam Goldman and Yetta Land were very prominent in this mobilization. And I also interviewed residents who recalled some direct action protests. One a Jewish former resident recalled in the summer of 1937 witnessing, in his words, quote, 2 or 3 Jewish communists and a couple blacks enter the pool, which provoked the other bathers to get out of the pool and chant, get out, get out, get out. So you can get some sense of the tension there, but also the kind of civil rights activism that was very forward for the time. That reminds us more of something that took place during the 1960s, but some of these direct action tactics were being used as early as the 1930s. In 1938, after a Jewish and a black bather with the Youth NAACP Council who showed up at Forest Hill swimming pool were beaten, that resulted in both successful prosecution of the antagonists as well as an interracial swim meet that was sponsored at the facility. So that gives you some sense of the kinds of interracial activism and the role of Jews in standing up for black civil rights in that era. The resumption of black Southerners migrating to Cleveland during World War II created a severe housing crisis which put pressure on neighborhoods like Glenville and Mount Pleasant that already had an established African American population. We saw black home ownership increasing in these areas. Again, the middle class or more middling types were among the first arrivals. One local historian has described this as, quote, a combination of eager home buyers and equally eager sellers which opened these areas to black purchasers. And what I'm showing you here is the incredibly rapid demographic changeover during the 1940 and 1950 decade in Glenville, where the population doubled 20-fold to some 20,000 black residents by 1950. You can see really how concentrated that is in the blocks along East 105th Street. There are a couple blocks where there's actually a net loss in African American residents. Mount Pleasant also saw an increase, although it was less dramatic, where the population went from 8% to 22% African American by 1950. In Glenville, it was estimated that the Jewish population dropped by half just between the years 1940 to 1945, which is remarkable because this is during World War II when there's a severe housing shortage. So people were using wartime savings to upgrade their accommodations where possible, but that was more difficult to do even for whites during World War II. So you do get some sense of a rush to leave the neighborhood. In what might seem counterintuitive, the presence of a largely rental population in Mount Pleasant actually stretched out the demographic transition in that area. And in the late 1950s, there were still all white apartment buildings in Mount Pleasant, as my interviewees have told me. So you didn't have the kind of panic turnover that you saw in neighborhoods like Lee Harvard, which also had a small but significant Jewish presence in the 1950s. In fact, the initial kind of integration of that neighborhood came from a kind of crisis when a Jewish homeowner sold to an African-American, Wendell Stewart, in 1953. By 1961, there were rapid campaigns of real estate agents trying to generate a rapid turnover. This is a little outside of the scope of this presentation, but one other area I'm exploring is the collaboration between Jewish building companies building for African Americans. For example, the Federal Homes Incorporated, which was owned by two Jewish Glenville graduates, Stanley and Charles Bernath, and they specifically built for black families in southeast Cleveland on vacant land in the Lee Seville neighborhood. So racial residential transition in Glenville, Mount Pleasant unfolded not without tension, but without any significant violence besides the example of the pools that I mentioned earlier. There were tensions reported in the schools, and in both neighborhoods, Jewish residents shared perceptions that nighttime vandalism, juvenile delinquency, and crime were on the increase. There's still debates about how much of that was perception versus reality, but this was mentioned by staff at the Council Education Alliance in both Glenville and Mount Pleasant as leading to a drop-off, a falling off of participation and diminished use of public spaces like Woodland Hills Park. Another phenomenon was the sale of formerly prominent Jewish institutions as an indicator of this demographic transition. In 1950, the Call and Post counted more than 20 such transfers that had either taken place or were pending, and perhaps most strikingly was the sale of Glenville's Jewish Center, Anshe Emeth, to the Black Corey Methodist Church in 1947 for $135. This was about 1/10 of its assessed value. Jewish-owned businesses also moved out of both neighborhoods, although this was a more gradual process. The last Jewish-owned business moved out of Glenville a couple years ago. That was a bike shop, and some of you may be familiar with the Schwitz in Mount Pleasant, which is no longer Jewish-owned, but it has a continuous history going back to the 1920s as a Russian-Turkish steam bath. Just to kind of finish out this presentation, I would mention the kind of interracial activism in the form of the Glenville Area Community Council and the Mount Pleasant Community Council that were founded in 1945 and 1946, respectively. Both of these organizations developed a broadly conceived neighborhood agenda that extended to recreational facilities, housing upkeep, crime prevention, restricting liquor availability, but really they got their initial impetus as promoting good intergroup relations. They failed to attract significant participation by Catholics. Among whites, the vast majority of participants were Jewish, and it didn't stop them from moving out of the neighborhood, but it did arguably mitigate the kind of interracial tensions that in other areas and other cities accompanied this process of transition. And the Council Education Alliance actively promoted interracial toleration efforts. They actually opened the facilities to African Americans as early as 1944 in Mount Pleasant, as well as Italian Americans. That generated some resentment among the traditional Jewish constituency, although the staff tried to kind of mediate and promote those kinds of interactions, even as they made plans to move the facilities further out, so that the 105th Street house moved to Superior through the eastern portion of Glenville in 1947, where it remained for about another 10 years. The Mount Pleasant branch moved to Shaker and Lee in 1949. And even before these moves, staff noted that Jewish youth were starting to patronize facilities in Cleveland Heights, even while they still lived in the neighborhood. So there's some kind of status anxieties and a kind of association of these increasingly black neighborhoods as kind of declining in status. So again, Jewish residents did share some of these perceptions in the whole, even as they were on the cutting edge of civil rights activism. As late as 1957, members from the Shaker Lee branch were still participating in Brotherhood Week observances in Mount Pleasant. As you can see here, they were also on the program of this folk festival. This has kind of a throwback popular front feel to it with all the different nationalities, and you can see Yiddish included on the program here in 1958 at a point when, as we'll hear, virtually all the Jewish population had moved out of the neighborhood. So basically what I'm seeing here is a kind of another illustration of what Lila Corwin-Berwin has described as Jews remaining invested in the city even after departing for the suburbs. Thank you very much.
One second. Well, I'm just trying to position this where it's maybe not, there, so that there are not all the icons showing. As you can see, I do not have a PowerPoint, but I do have one image that I think, even though it's not showing up very well, it will hopefully give a bit of a geographical sense of the things and the places I'm going to speak of. I'd also like to thank the Western Reserve Historical Society, the Jewish Jewish Federation of Cleveland, and the other sponsors of this program. I'm delighted to be here. My talk is titled Jewish Suburbanization and Jewish Presence in the City Without Jews. In the early 1960s, Cleveland Jewish Federation Executive Director Sidney Vincent called Cleveland a city without Jews. Unlike Cleveland's nationality groups, which did not, in his words, totally abandon the old neighborhoods, but rather spread outward from a home base that remains identifiably and substantially Hungarian or Polish or whatever, the Jewish withdrawal is total and rapid. Vincent was hardly exaggerating, but his comments also did not capture the full story. The proportion of Jewish children in Cleveland's public schools dropped from 53% in 1944 to less than 2% in 1961. But even the Cleveland Heights, University Heights school system's proportion of Jewish public school pupils sagged from 51% to 47% between 1955 and 1961. Had he been commenting in the late 1960s, Vincent would have found that the more newsworthy statistic was that, for the first time, more than 60% of Jewish children were enrolled outside both the Cleveland and the CHUH systems. Not only had Cleveland lost its Jewish population, but so too were the inner ring suburbs at a crossroads in their appeal to Jews. Jewish flight from Cleveland was perhaps swifter and more complete than in other cities, but it continued a pattern that had been underway since the 19th century. Yet, once Jews crossed beyond the city limits, their movement triggered changes beyond the neighborhood level. Jewish civic presence in Cleveland continued, but as in other cities like Detroit, it was largely what Lila Corwin-Berwin has called politics of remote urban activism. Although the Jewish Community Federation moved its offices to a new building on Euclid Avenue in 1965 as a symbolic commitment to downtown, its work inside the city limits, led mostly by Jewish suburbanites, was increasingly one of trying to offset urban decay through investments in health and welfare while reacting to the Jewish exodus to the eastern suburbs. My essay explores Jewish suburbanization in Cleveland in the 1940s to 1980s, focusing on Jewish institutional responses. It examines how Jewish institutional policymakers sought the proper balance between facilitating and resisting suburbanization. I argue that even as Jews streamed eastward into several suburbs, their predominant concentration in Cleveland Heights prompted in leaders a greater degree of introspection about the ramifications of outward mobility in the 1960s than at any point up to that time. However, despite the successes of their stabilization efforts in the 1960s and 70s, Jewish community leaders also could not ignore the fact that their institutions were continuing to lose their hold on more and more members who moved further into the outer suburbs. The next section is titled "To Stay or to Go," with a question mark. Tellingly, as early as 1936, the Council Educational Alliance started its first extension programs in the Superior Through area of eastern Glenville. The CEA's extension model, developed in Cleveland, reportedly set the standard for JCCs nationwide. It was also an early recognition that, even at its height, Glenville was already something of a revolving door rather than a stable community. For nearly 2 decades, a growing number of Jewish families had been moving to Cleveland Heights. The 1940s and 1950s, in particular, proved fateful decades in terms of institutional decisions about their future in the city. The institutions that stayed in the city were very much exceptions to the rule of following population flight to the suburbs. Jewish leaders demonstrated great adroitness when contemplating how to keep pace with the moving target of the continually recentering Jewish population. The Jewish Community Federation emerged after World War II as the entity most responsible for reorienting Jewish institutions to serve an increasingly suburban population. Through studies, surveys, and directives, the JCF provided leadership and resources to facilitate relocation. Likewise, the formation of the Jewish Community Centers of Cleveland, or JCCs, an amalgamation of several agencies initiated in 1948 and made permanent 4 years later, gave its activities a, quote, essentially suburban orientation, end quote. As the Cleveland Press editorialized in 1950, the JCCs of Cleveland, quote, are sensitive to new developments and new shifts in the Jewish community. They don't remain in one spot until the need has gone, end quote. Communal agencies resisted establishing beachheads in advance of the leading edge of population movement out of concern that doing so might accelerate that movement. But at the same time, they had to be ever vigilant to avoid falling too far behind the migration. Next, I'll turn to the rise of Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights as growing population centers of the Jewish community. And I'm sorry, I'm using the term Jewish community that I was cautioned not to use yesterday. I'll think about that between now and writing my chapter. The solidification of Jewish suburbanization and its impact on Jewish communal life is perhaps best viewed in the twin transitions of Jews from Superior Through to Cleveland Heights and from Mount Pleasant to Shaker Heights. By the war's end, some 40,000 Jews lived in Cleveland Heights. The rapid movement of Jewish residents to Cleveland Heights led the Council Educational Alliance to open Heights House in 1945. At that time, the CEA converted to extension service in the East 105th Street area of Glenville. Arlington House, a CEA branch in Superior Through, remained fairly stable through the 1940s as it absorbed some of the eastward migration from the East 105th area. But by the mid-1950s, the pull of Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights was being felt. In part, the Council Educational Alliance's and subsequently the JCC's own actions abetted the process. Heights House intensified service to junior high school youth through its centralization of canteens in the Cleveland Heights Masonic Temple. However, the JCCs responded to clear shifts already underway. Families with junior high or high school aged children were moving away where the youths could be closer to more of their peers. And I'm reminded of Samantha's picture from Harvey Picar, in which that one cell shows exactly that. My parents wanted me to go closer to where I would be around other Jews. Arlington House remained open, but tailored its activities to appeal to quote-unquote older Jews who remained, and as well as English classes for the so-called New Americans or immigrants whose arrival prevented the wholesale collapse of Jewish presence in that area. It also remained involved through the end of the decade in the Glenville Area Community Council and Superior Through Neighborhood Organization, which were important community building vehicles for the incoming African American population that Glenville attracted, and Todd has suggested that as well. 4 miles south of Glenville, where Mount Pleasant House had operated since 1928, much discussion after the war went into relocating to the east. Some argued that locating near the intersection of Kinsman and Lee roads made the most sense, while others contended that with the ongoing eastward movement, a location nearer Kinsman and Warrensville Center roads might be warranted. However, building too far east of Lee Road would create a hardship in that it would not be well served by public transportation. Thus, the pull of suburbia was held somewhat in check by the amenities of the city. In 1947, sensing the eastward drift of the area's Jewish population toward Shaker Heights, the Council Educational Alliance's Mount Pleasant Advisory Committee recommended renting a storefront in the Kinsman-Lee district to start an extension program. 2 years later, the JCCs acquired an 8-room house at 3638 Lee Road and sold the Mount Pleasant house. Despite the care that went into the matter, the burden of needing to be on top of population movement arguably helped redraw perceptual boundaries, making Mount Pleasant's decline as a Jewish center a self-fulfilling prophecy. Indeed, after the Shaker Lee House opened in 1950, Mount Pleasant House remained open for 2 more years, but found that whatever families with children remained nearby preferred the new facility and the upwardly mobile connotation its name bestowed. Their choices had consigned Mount Pleasant House to failure years before the CEA sold the facility in 1952 to be used by, quote, a group of Negro Masonic lodges, end quote. As the population continued to grow in Cleveland Heights, there was much talk about establishing a centrally located Jewish community center. In 1946, the discussion of location focused on University Circle and the Cedar-Taylor area of Cleveland Heights. A University Circle location had the advantage of being well positioned to attract both nearby college students and, in the daytime, professionals from downtown. To some, however, University Circle would be increasingly peripheral as Jewish population filtered farther east. By that calculus, even Cedar-Taylor, the heart of the Jewish community at the time, might soon be left behind. In the meantime, the JCC's Cleveland Heights service continued at Heights House. Unlike in 1945, when the Jewish influx into the Heights was in full swing, by the late 1950s, the discourse about locating a new central JCC's facility was less attuned to anticipating future growth than to conserving the Jewish population in the Heights. In a letter to the Cleveland Heights City Council to request rezoning of land for a Jewish community center on Mayfield Road, Morton Mandel pointed out that the JCC's services were, quote, a deterrent to decay psychologically and physically, end quote, adding that JCCs and, by implication, the general presence of Jews tended to, quote, stabilize property values, end quote. The Unified Jewish Community Center opened in Cleveland Heights in 1961, symbolically erasing East 105th Street and Kinsman Road as centers of Jewish civic life. Next, I move in my work to what I'm calling the specter of decline in Kinsman, Shaker, and Cleveland Heights. The early 1960s marked a crossroads in the suburbanization of the Jewish community, bringing an end of group service activities inside the Cleveland city limits, but also the first expressions of concern about deterioration in the suburbs. Within 5 years of opening the Kinsman Lee branch, In 1955, new Jewish Community Federation data on Yom Kippur school absences revealed, quote, major shifts, end quote, away from the Kinsman and Arlington section, both of the city and into the Heights and Shaker school systems. The Shaker Lee House reported as early as 1956 that in spite of growing overall participation in its programs, the response from residents to the north and east of the branch, i.e. Shaker Heights, was lagging. Quote, we find a feeling that the branch has little status in the community and therefore people are reluctant to use us, end quote. 2 years later, it all but blamed this loss of interest on, quote, growing restlessness, end quote, near East 154th Street just outside Shaker, from which Jewish parents fled, quote, to avoid using the nearby junior high school where the Negro population has been growing, end quote. As part of an effort to bolster a new center of Jewish civic life around the new Jewish Community Center in Cleveland Heights, that year the JCC's board finally closed its Shaker Lee and Arlington houses. Even Cleveland Heights, with its large concentration of Jewish institutions and its new Jewish Community Center, was beginning to face growing concerns about instability. By 1963, the JCC's staff, JCC's staff, meaning some on the staff, began reporting concerns about the lower Coventry area near Mayfield Road, including what they said was an influx of new Americans, Golden Agers, and marginal families. The United Youth Program of the Cleveland Welfare Federation also cited the Coventry district as having, quote unquote, serious teenage problems, leading one JCC's board member to observe that Coventry seemed to be going the way of Glenville and Mount Pleasant. By 1969, just 8 years after opening, the JCC in Cleveland Heights had reportedly reached, quote, the saturation point, end quote, in terms of its capacity to offer activities. Despite being at its peak, however, the center also now stood on the periphery of the Jewish community, whose geographical center had continued its push toward Beechwood. Tellingly, Cleveland Heights High School, which once enrolled a Jewish majority, now counted only about 500 Jews among its 3,000 students. With the departure of senior adult residential communities like Menorah Park and Montefiore Home to Beechwood, a Cleveland Heights Jewish Community Center was particularly ill-positioned to serve the elderly. Over the next 3 years, the proportion of non-Jews among new center members soared from 11% to 28%, in part reflecting the changing population of Cleveland Heights. Many accepted and even actively supported the racial integration of Cleveland Heights, as is well known, working within and across race and faith boundaries to create a strong, stable, diverse community. However, not everyone was so supportive. Many remembered the rapid racial transition that had transformed the East 105th Street Jewish neighborhood in the 1940s and 50s and saw in Cleveland Heights the leading edge of a similar situation, a transition, along with similarly concerning influxes of what they called hippies and motorcyclists in the Coventry area. The bulk of the integration in Cleveland Heights occurred on or near Lee Road, south of Mayfield Road, on the edge of the center of Jewish institutional life, according to one quote. One man voiced his fear that African Americans were, in his words, overrunning the neighborhood surrounding the JCC. He added that he did not agree that, quote, we Jews had to assume the full white man's burden until West Side suburbs like Parma would agree to take their fair share, meaning of African Americans. Whatever might be said of his views on race, the man understood the costs of constantly fleeing change. Quote, where are we going to go, and who is going to pay for the next generation of institutional buildings, he asked. The Jewish Community Federation also understood well the costs of keeping up with population shifts. It was in this context that it invested in the Heights Area Project in 1972. The initiative included both counseling and a mortgage assistance program to encourage young Jewish families to move to Cleveland Heights. Working with synagogues that made loans guaranteed by the JCF, the program brought homes within the reach of many families. In support of the Heights Area Project, in 1970, when the Jewish Community Center's Study Committee recommended developing more substantial programs to the southeast, the JCCs did not act on the recommendation out of an interest in, quote, preserving Cleveland Heights, end quote. And I want to pause for just 1 second to say that I just caught something in my own writing. I mentioned in support of the Heights Area Project by, say, in 1970. So I think what I really need to do there is rethink. They didn't mention Heights Area Project by name. I conflated the two, and I now see that mistake. But there was, even before Heights Area Project, certainly a growing interest in preserving, a strong, stable Jewish presence in Cleveland Heights and contributing to the greater community. So I want to go back and look at that again. Around the same time, so early 1970s, Park Synagogue also committed to maintaining its primary facility in Cleveland Heights, even as it discussed establishing some Eastern Branch services. Rabbi Armand Cohen hoped that such services might cater to those living well east of Park, while also serving, in his words, to halt the expensive and wasteful practice of synagogues in Cleveland transplanting themselves every 25 or 50 years, leaving behind a record of blight, end quote. Although the Heights Area Project successfully conserved a mostly Orthodox and conservative Jewish concentration along or near Taylor Road, by the early 1980s, Jewish leaders could no longer ignore the recentering of most of the Jewish population in and around Beechwood. In the 8 years after 1970, the Jewish population in Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights, University Heights, and South Euclid altogether dropped by 24%. That's in 8 years. While in Beechwood, Lyndhurst, Mayfield Heights, and Pepper Pike, collectively, it grew by over 30%. A decade after the idea of moving east was first broached, leaders began discussing moving toward 2 JCC's facilities, carefully planning the new facility to complement but not duplicate the offerings in the Cleveland Heights facility. In addition, the JCC on Mayfield Road was to undergo a thorough renovation to maintain its attractiveness, taking advantage of the City of Cleveland Heights' offer of extensive funds in exchange for a 20-year commitment to remain open. The dual JCC model, while representing a continuation of the longtime Jewish commitment to providing services for all Jews, also departed from earlier policies of following the population migration and downgrading service in the places it left behind. Like the Heights Area Project, and indeed because of the need to foster it, the willingness to consider reinvesting in the Heights JCC represented a maturing realization that unabated suburban flight was the antithesis of metropolitan stability. And I want to close by just saying that, where am I going next? In my complete paper draft, I offered a sort of preliminary conclusion in addition to a fairly substantive section that considered the challenges Jewish families themselves faced when moving into the suburbs. But I still have a lot of research that I want to do. I hope, for one thing, to delve into the Cleveland Jewish News Digital Archive, though it only goes back to 1964. For earlier years, I'll need to find either clipping files or hit the microfilm pretty hard as best I can. I also hope that various congregational records at Western Reserve Historical Society will prove useful. I've identified possibly useful collections for several congregations. So far, I've mainly mined the Jewish Community Federation and Jewish Community Centers of Cleveland collections, and I've, in addition, looked at several other collections that I need to go back to in more depth. So in closing, I would like to thank you again, and I welcome any comments or questions following the session.
I want to thank all 3 panelists.
Thank you.
You said that one of the things you're looking forward to doing is synagogue relocation. And in my research, I've found considerable material on that. In particular, there's one really seminal article by Rabbi Porath in March of 1945, where he talked about, in essence, here we go again. In his career, he had seen the turnover from the East 55th Street neighborhoods in the 1920s, and here in 1945 the writing is on the wall, and he talks in a Yiddish article in the Jewish World about how we need, what we need to do, how we need to give thought to institutional transplantation. And, if you don't have Yiddish, I'll translate it for you.
I don't. That would be very helpful.
Thanks so much, Ira.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Michael?
This has to do with African American and Jewish relations and the neighborhoods left behind. Are either of you going to be exploring the percentage of apartment ownership and retail ownership left behind by Jews, and the relationship between the black community and the Jewish community, or those people left behind? And then also John Hawley and buying where you're employed, that aspect of it, particularly in Dr. Michny's paper.
Absolutely. I do explore that in my work. I guess I would like to incorporate more of it. I've looked at city directories, which can sometimes give you an indication of where the ownership lies. I've come across more anecdotal evidence of African-American employees of longstanding Jewish businesses, especially in Mount Pleasant, where I have a better grip. But I think it's a really important topic because that remains kind of the longest standing Jewish presence in these neighborhoods, as I mentioned, extending into the 1980s or even beyond in a couple cases.
We'll swing back up to your room.
I have a question about the last paper on suburbanization. What is the outside date at which to which you're going to examine suburbanization? Are you going to have any comments on if there's an outer boundary to what's considered suburbanization? And are you going to talk at all about the re-entry of Jews now back into the city of Cleveland?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I don't know how, or I sense I need to address that, and I thought about it before I came here, sort of anticipating this type of question. In fact, I don't have an answer right now, and I'm not sure how I will go about determining. It's hard to talk about where things are going next, but I think you can already see, as you said, for a long time, I'm thinking back to about 1960, there was a comment there's a collection here at Western Reserve of confidential interviews done by a political scientist at Western Reserve University over a period of about 8 years. And it's a wonderful window into so many aspects of mid-century Cleveland. Extraordinarily rich, in fact. There's a comment in there by, I can't remember now the person, but it was a Jewish, a prominent Jew in Cleveland, I'll leave it at that, who said that aside from a few buildings in Shaker Square, there were no places in the city to which young Jews might want to, commence their early adulthood, and that there was, other than maybe the Gold Coast of Lakewood, there was essentially nothing at that time. And so now it's very different. Of course, downtown has plenty of attractive options, and there are plenty of neighborhoods that are pretty enticing, regardless of one's background. So I think I need to think more about this back to the city movement, and also the countervailing trend to keep pushing outward. So I think we're pulling apart as other metropolitan areas are. There's a tendency to recenter, but I'm not convinced that it'll be very strong in the long term. We'll have to see.
I don't know if you're aware that the Chabad of Cleveland has opened a synagogue and facilities in Cleveland, and they claim that when Chabad comes someplace, that means there's a significant Jewish presence. So they're opening in the city and what that means for those institutions. And the final point is, I understand anecdotally that many people who grew up in Shaker Heights and in Beechwood are repurchasing, especially in Shaker Heights, in areas because they don't seem to have the antipathy to diversity in their neighborhoods that perhaps their parental or grandparent generation had. So I don't know if you want to have a section on future possibilities.
Thank you very much.
Todd, did I sense a comment while I passed the
I
microphone?
just had a thought of maybe a way to connect the papers. I think of someone like Harvey Pekar, who continued to live in that Mount Pleasant Shaker border area into the 70s at least. And so we think about people coming back to the city in a sense. Jews attracted to African American culture, especially jazz music, are continuing to visit those areas, buy records in those areas, attend clubs. I interviewed a lot of people who would go to jazz clubs in the 50s and 60s. And so it's not as if this kind of departure completely precludes any continued connection to these neighborhoods.
He ended up in Cleveland Heights then for the last, like 20 years of adulthood. And he liked the diversity of the neighborhood.
I may be one of the few in the audience who is old enough to say that none of this is history. It was all current events. Yeah. But I found the presentation on the Jewish movement very, very interesting. I experienced some of that myself and saw it in my lifetime. But I'm very surprised that in neither of the two presentations on the migration, nobody mentioned the Ludlow Project. Because I would maintain to you that if it hadn't been for the Ludlow Project, which was, I would say, quite predominantly Jewish in its leadership, Shaker Heights probably would have been a community that tipped just as much as Glenville did or East Cleveland did in its time. Maybe not totally, but very much so. And that project was very important, I think, in the migration pattern. And it might be too early for that first or too late for that first presentation, because it was in the 60s area, 50s and 60s, but it should be somewhere in this whole project, because Shaker Heights is what it is today because of that effort.
The only reason I didn't address it, and in part because it's not this isn't a complete work, and I'm still thinking this is very preliminary. I focused initially mostly on Jewish institutions, just as an organizing principle, because I felt that this is such a tremendous topic. I almost envisioned writing a book about this one subject, which I think could be done very easily. But yeah, Ludlow was very much in my mind, and I ended up not including it right now, but it was not forgotten or
somehow.
I appreciate your point.
Jewish history, it certainly got to be part of it because it was a very major part, and to my recollection, it was a very heavy Jewish presence in leading that effort. In fact, I knew some of the leaders of it myself.
Ever since my conversations with David Hammack when I was still a graduate student, who's sitting right there, I've been aware of this connection, and in a way, I've been wanting to assert that the kinds of interracial activism that we see in the Glenville Area Community Council and the Mount Pleasant Community Council are kind of rehearsal for what we see in Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights, and that we're more successful. The same sorts of rhetoric, the same sorts of programming was attempted earlier, but it just was a little premature. And there were some actual individuals, either the children of people who participated, but I can't draw that connection quite so directly as I would like to, but I think implicitly it's there. And by the 1960s or late 50s, we've got a different kind of possibility so that those are, and also less population pressure, I would note. Some people have kind of noted that East Cleveland was quote unquote sacrificed in some people's rhetoric. So it serves as a kind of to absorb some of that black population outflow so that Cleveland Heights could have a different sort of experience with integration. But I appreciate your pointing that out, and I think that's certainly worth exploring.
On the first presentation, I'd just like to comment, I was surprised there was so little on Siegel and Schuster. I mean, they were the people who started it, and to most Clevelanders, or Jewish Clevelanders certainly, they know that Siegel and Schuster started it, and there was no mention that I heard of what happened to them. I know that they sold it for a tiny amount of money, but then they had litigation years later that did restore to them some monetary support, which I think is part of the whole story. I was sort of surprised on the tremendous concentration on Picard, because Picard was not an important person in many ways. He was certainly not a part of the Jewish community as such. He was not a great part of the general community as such in Cleveland. And yet the whole presentation seemed to be directed toward his life. And to most people in Cleveland, he was sort of just an irascible sort of person who was not part of the community project at all.
So the short of it is that because my paper is about Harvey Picard, it's not about Superman. It's about Everyman versus Superman. In other words, I'm going to focus on Harvey Picard and his Everyman status, with Superman just as kind of a side note and a foil to that. I feel like Superman's been discussed so much. I don't have an interest in rehashing that. Rather, I think I want to show Picard's importance to the city of Cleveland, especially posthumously. He's really been celebrated in some important ways, and he had a national audience for a long time and was quite a pop culture figure. So I think I'm going to go in that direction.
And with that, we are at the time to break off questions, so the remaining questions should probably be over coffee and snacks during the break. So thank you very much.
Thank you.